Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to look at RAID volumes and snapshots, and essentially we're going to teach you two things. We're going to teach you how to create a Windows instance and then attach a bunch of different volumes and create a RAID group of those volumes. And then at the end of this lecture we're going to teach you how to take application consistent snapshots of volumes, and I'm just going to teach you how to do that in a theoretical perspective rather than doing that through a lab. So let's just start with what RAID actually is. So RAID stands for a redundant array of independent disks, and essentially it's putting a whole bunch of disks together and they act as one disk to the operating system. Now you get a whole bunch of different RAIDs. You get RAID 0. This is most commonly used in gaming PCs, for example. This is where you stripe your two volumes, so you've got two disks or more, and you basically stripe across those disks. The good thing about RAID 0 is you get very good performance. The bad thing is there's no redundancy. So let's say you have 3 or 4 disks and you create a single volume across these 3 or 4 disks. If you lose one of those disks, if one of those disks fails, you will lose your entire RAID array. You then get RAID 1, which is mirrored, and essentially that's where you've got one disk and you mirror it, an exact copy of it to another disk. So that's called a RAID 1. The good thing about RAID 1s is you get redundancy. So if one disk fails, you can still use the RAID array using the other disk. We then have RAID 5. Now RAID 5 is where you get 3 disks or more, and basically you're writing parity to another disk. It's a bit beyond the scope of this course, but there is something you should know. Amazon really discourage you from making RAID 5s on EBS. So if you're ever in an exam and one of the answers is to create a RAID 5, don't fall for it. RAID 5s essentially are spread across multiple disks and you're writing a parity. Parity is basically, it's a checksum. So if one of those disks fails, you can rebuild the RAID array using a checksum. And that's just basically a mathematical formula which tells you what the missing data is. So RAID 5s are good in the real world, but you do not typically use them on AWS. And then finally we have RAID 10, and it's a combination of RAID 1 and RAID 0. So it's where you've got striping as well as mirroring. And that gives you very good redundancy and very good performance. Now, where would you use RAID arrays on AWS? Well, the simple answer is when you are not getting the disk I/O that you require. So you may have a single volume and you've provisioned it to its maximum size and you still need higher disk I/O. So what's your solution? Well, you add multiple volumes and you create a RAID array to give you the disk I/O that you desire. And typically your RAID arrays are going to be either RAID 0 or RAID 10, to be honest. On AWS. So that's where you're basically taking EBS volumes and you're putting them together to create a single volume in a redundant array of independent disks. So you may get an exam question and it has a scenario where you're not getting the disk I/O that you require. It may be for a database that is not essentially supported by AWS. It might be Cassandra, for example. So you need to use this database on EC2. So what's your solution? Well, you go in and you add multiple EBS volumes and then you configure them as a RAID array. So that is what we are going to do now. I'm going to show you how to do this on a Windows PC. So you'll need to go to your EC2 console. So if we just go into EC2, the first thing we're going to do is just go down to our security groups, and you'll probably have a security group in here that you use or have been using in the course. So I'm going to use my web DMZ, and just in the inbound rules I'm going to go in and edit these, and we're going to add remote desktop protocol, which is port 3389. So if we just go down here and we are looking for RDP, and then you can see 3389 as the port range, and you could either say anywhere or just my IP. I'm going to do my IP address, hit save. Okay, and now that I've got that security group created, I'm just going to go over to my EC2 dashboard, and I'm going to go over to launch instance, and then I'm just going to scroll down, and you're looking for this free tier eligible. And we're just going to go down to the Windows Server 2012 R2 and hit select. And then we're just going to use a T2 micro, and
We can leave this all as default. If you do want to play around with accessing S3, you can select your S3 IAM role that we created earlier. Ignore the other IAM roles. These are stuff that I've been doing in regards to my other courses. So I'm just going to give it S3 access, and we'll click next and add the storage. Now we're going to add 4 additional volumes. These are all going to be SSD volumes, 8 gigs in size. And so that's great. We'll go next and tag it. We'll just call this My Windows VM. And now I'm just going to add it to an existing security group. So I'm going to do it to my web DMZ. And so now you can see here's RDP and it's open to my specific IP address. So I'm going to hit review and launch. Now it's not eligible for free tier, and that's simply because I've added so many different volumes to it. So do bear that in mind. If you do go ahead with this lecture, it might cost you a few cents. Just remember to shut down the instance when you're done, or delete off the Elastic, the EBS volumes from this particular instance. So I'm going to go ahead and hit launch. And now you'll see here it's talking about existing key pair, so I'm going to just create a new key pair, and then I'm just going to call it My Windows Key. And I'm going to download this, and using this key pair, basically it's going to generate the administrator password for us. And we'll see how we do that, but I'm just going to click download. Okay, so that's downloaded, and I'm going to go to launch instances. Okay, so this is just launching, and I'm just going to go across here. You'll see I've got lots of different VMs that have either stopped or terminated. That's again from other lectures that I've been doing. And I'm just going to pause the video here and wait for this Windows VM to become live. You'll typically find that Windows does take a little bit longer than Linux for Amazon to provision, and that's typical across every cloud platform I've ever worked on. Okay, so that's now finished, and you can see it here. We can get the IP address. So the next thing we need to do is go in and log into this EC2 instance. So typically you would RDP into your Windows instance, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. And when you're RDPing in, you're going to need to use a username and password. And with Windows, the username is administrator, and then the password is something we're going to have to get from the AWS platform. So if you click on your Windows instance and then go down to the Actions section, and you'll see here there's a button that says Get Windows Password. And the way you get the Windows password is by cutting and pasting your private key into here. You can also just get Amazon to get it by uploading the file. So I'm just going to go and navigate to my Windows private key that we just created, and you can see it in there. And now I'll go to decrypt password, and it's decrypted the password, and I'm just going to copy this into my clipboard. And you can see that's my IP address, that's the username is administrator, and the password is that. And that's what I need to use to connect to my Windows instance. So I'm going to Alt-Tab over to remote desktop. I am on a Mac, so if you're on a Windows PC, the easiest way to get this open is to go to your start bar and type in MSTSC, so that's Mike Sierra Tango Sierra Charlie, and that stands for Microsoft Terminal Services Client, MSTSC. Okay, so what we need to do now is we're going to create a new connection. And in here we're going to need the connection name, the username, and the password. So I'm just going to Alt-Tab back in here. So the connection name is going to be the public IP address. And by the way, you can get this remote desktop client on the App Store if you are using a Mac. And I'm going to cut and paste it's administrator, so I'm just going to cut and paste the password as well. So the PC name. Here I'm just going to enter the IP address again, 52.16.39.174. And then here the username is administrator, and then the password is the password. Oops, just close that down. Okay, so I'm now going to go in and close this and hit connect. And it's basically, this will always come up and you just say continue, and it can take a little bit, so if it doesn't load in the next couple of seconds I will just pause the video sometimes it can take a while to establish the session. So I'm just going to pause the video now, and here we go. It's just starting to boot up now. So that took at least a minute from when I paused the video to seeing this screen, and because it is a micro instance, it can be a little bit slow as opposed to if you're using a larger instance. So again, I'm going to pause the video here and just wait for this for the desktop to appear. Okay, so that took a few minutes for it to load up, and now if we can see that we've got our Windows desktop. If we go down here and open up Explorer, you'll be able to see there is a C drive. There's also a D, E, F, and G, which have been mapped, and those are our different EBS partitions. So the first thing we want to do is go in and have a look at this. So if you right click on the start bar and go to disk management, and by the way, if you're a Mac user, right clicking in RDP can be a bit of a pain. You've got to use 2 fingers depending on what OS you're doing, but the newest OS you should use 2 fingers on the trackpad basically. And you can go in here and you can see disk 1, disk 2, disk 3, disk 4. These are our EBS separate EBS partitions, and so they have already been automatically mounted. Now, as mentioned in the start of the lecture, specifically there's an exam question around how you can improve I/O, and the way you would do this is by creating a RAID. So that's what we're going to do now. So if you right click on the first volume and you just go to delete volume, I'll give you a warning message saying it's going to erase all data. Just hit yes. We're going to do this for all 4 volumes. So just go ahead and hit delete volume. Here we go. Delete volume, and go in and delete volume. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click, and you can right click on a unallocated volume, and you can say new simple volume, new spanned volume, new stripe volume, new mirrored volume, new RAID 5 volume. Now for the purposes of this course, we're just going to create a striped volume, which is effectively RAID 0, and just hit next. And basically you want to go in and add all of the disks in across here. So we've got disk 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to hit next, and then we're going to assign the drive letter D to this new volume. I'm going to hit next again. You want to perform a quick format, and just leave the other one unchecked, and it's going to be NTFS, and we're just going to call it new volume, and click next and hit finished. And then it's basically saying it's going to change this from a basic disk to a dynamic disk. Don't worry, this isn't an MCITP or MCSE course, so you don't need to know what that is. All you need to know for the exam is that if you want to increase the disk I/O, you can add additional EBS volumes and create a RAID, and then that will be spread across multiple EBS volumes. So here we go, it's created our new volume D. This is now across 4 EBS volumes, and in theory we would get much higher disk I/O from this than if we were just using the root directory.
Okay, so we've learnt how to create a RAID array using multiple EBS volumes, and we've learnt the reasons for doing this is so that we can increase our disk I/O past a single EBS volume. The next thing you need to understand is how can you take a snapshot of a RAID array. Okay, so there's a bit of a problem here, and that's basically when you take a snapshot, the snapshot excludes the data that's being held in the cache by the application and by the operating system. Now, this actually doesn't tend to matter on a single volume. However, when you're using multiple volumes in a RAID array, this can be a problem basically due to the interdependencies of the EBS volumes in that array. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we need to take an application consistent snapshot. That's how we solve it. So how do we actually do that? Well, basically we have to stop the application from writing to the disk, and we need to flush all the caches to the disk itself. And how do we do that? Well, it's really, really simple. You can do it using these 3 different methods. You can freeze the file system, you can unmount the RAID array, and pretty much the easiest and what most people do is you just shut down the EC2 instance, you take a snapshot and then you power it back up again, and that will give you an application consistent snapshot. So if you do see a scenario-based question in the exam and it's talking about trying to take a snapshot of a RAID array, and the best way to go about doing it, look for either freezing the file system, unmounting the RAID array, and then taking a snapshot, or the easiest way of them all is to simply shut down the associated EC2 instance, take a snapshot, and then power it back up again. Okay, that's it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.